So today we're going to look at solving equations by factoring, or we're going to look at all types of quadratic equations. So factoring, completing the square, the quadratic formula. So if we were to solve by factoring, we need to make sure that everything is on one side, okay? So it has to be equal to a 0. Whatever is on this side, we are going to completely factor. And you'll set both factors or all factors equal to 0 and solve. Okay, so let's do an example here. Okay, so I have x squared minus 13x is equal to a 30. So this is not equal to a 0, so I do need to move on the other side. So I'm going to move that negative 30 to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared minus a 13x minus a 30 is going to be equal to a 0. So now we need to completely factor. So we got it equal to 0, and now we need to completely factor. So we're going to just kind of ignore this and say it's a trinomial. So what multiplies together to give you a negative 30 and adds together to give you a negative 13, which is a negative 15 and a positive 2. Okay, those are my two factors. So x minus 15 is going to be set equal to 0, and then x plus 2 is going to be set equal to 0. So x is going to be equal to a positive 15, and x is going to be equal to a negative 2. Okay. All right, you do this one, solving by factoring. So take a minute and solve this one, please. Okay, so everything needs to be on one side. So I'm going to move the x over, and I'm going to move the 4 over. So my polynomial is going to change into 5x squared minus an x minus a 4. You moved all that over, so now it's equal to a 0. Okay, so now I want to factor. So I'm going to completely factor 5x squared minus x minus 4. So what multiplies together to give you a negative 20 and adds together to give you a 1. So that'll be x minus 5 times x plus a 4 divided by 5. So x minus 1 times 5x plus a 4 is completely factored. Okay, set both of those equal to 0, and you will solve. Okay, so x is going to be equal to a 1, and move the 4 over, so it's a negative 4, so x is going to be equal to a negative 4/5. Okay. The other way that we have to solve quadratic equations is the square root method, but this one can only be done This one can only be done when we have a square term and we have a constant. Okay, so when I solve this, I isolate the square term. So when you isolate the square term, you will, for this one, add 81 to both sides here. So you'll get x squared is equal to a positive 81. So now I've isolated it completely, so now you're going to take the square root. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root. So x here is going to be equal to positive and then negative 9. So it can only be done when you've got a square term and a number. Okay, y'all take a minute and do this one for me. Okay, the square term is not by itself because it's got that -6 attached to it. So I am going to divide both sides by a -6. So here I'm going to have x is going to be equal, or x squared is going to be equal to a -8. So now I'm going to take the square root of both sides here. So I'm going to have x is going to be equal to plus or minus I square roots of 8. Because remember, the square root of a negative number is an I. The square root of an 8 is 4 times 2, so that is going to be plus or minus 2i square roots of 2. All right, y'all try to do this one for me. Okay, so subtract 10, you want to isolate the square term, so subtract the 10, so I'm going to have a -7x squared equals a -9, divide by a -7, so we're going to have an x squared is equal to a positive 9/7, and then I will take the square root of both sides. And so I'm going to have x equals plus or minus. Square root of a 9 is a 3. And then square root of a 7, I can't simplify. Rationalize this denominator, so I will multiply by square roots of 7. So my answer here will be plus or minus 3 square roots of 7 over a 7. Okay. All right, completing the square. Okay, so we want to move the c term to the opposite side. Okay, so you're going to then divide out a, so on both sides. Whatever it is, you're going to just divide the factor out, a. Complete the square by taking half of b and square it. That's why it's called complete the square. Add this number to both sides. Okay. So what that means is that you're going to take half of your b and square it, and you're going to add that number to both sides. You just added 0 there, so nothing changed. You just added 0. Factor this perfect square trinomial. And then you'll take the square root of both sides and solve. All right, so we're going to complete the square for this one here. So complete the square, okay? So first we're going to move the c term to the opposite side. So I'm going to have x squared plus a 12x is equal to a negative 20. There's no a in front of the x squared, so now I'm just going to take half of my b. So my b is 12, and I'm going to take half of it. So half of 12 is 6, and I'm going to square that and add that to both sides. So 6 squared is a 36, so I'm going to add that number to both sides. Okay, so I'm going to factor this perfect square trinomial, which is 6 times 6, so this is going to be x plus 6 times x plus 6, which is an x plus 6 squared. Negative 20 plus a 36 is going to be a positive 16. So now we've got a square term by itself, so I am going to take the square root of both sides here. So I'm going to be left with x plus a 6 is equal to plus or minus a 4. So now I'm going to have x plus 6 equals a negative 4, and x plus 6 equals a positive 4. Solve each one of these. Solve these equations, so you'll have x is equal to a negative 10 and x is equal to a negative 2. And yes, you are going to get the same answers as if you were factoring it or even using the quadratic formula, okay? All right, y'all do this one. And it does have a number in front of the x squared. So take about 5 minutes and do this one for me. Okay. So move the c term to the other side. So we'll add 25 to both sides. So you're going to have a 7x squared plus a 14x is equal to a negative 4 plus a 25, which is a positive 21. You're going to divide by 7 because there is that in the front. So you're going to have an x squared plus a 2x is equal to a 3. So now you're going to take half of your b term and you're going to square it. So half of 2 is 1, 1 squared is a 1. And you are going to add that to both sides here. Factor here, so we'll have x plus a 1 times x plus 1. 3 plus a 1 is a 4. And then take the square root of both sides. So you'll have x plus a 1 is equal to plus or minus a 2. So you're going to have two answers. So x plus 1 equals 2 and x plus 1 equals a negative 2. Subtract 1. So x will be equal to a 1 and x will be equal to a negative 3. Okay, So that is completing the square, and then the fourth way is the quadratic formula. Okay, so the quadratic formula is when everything is on one side. Okay, and the quadratic formula, you will use the coefficients. So you will use A, your B, and your C. So x is going to be equal to b squared minus this plus or minus the square root of negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over a 2a. So to use the quadratic formula, it all has to be on the same side. Okay, so let's do this one using the quadratic formula. So I would need to move the 10x over, so that means it would become a negative 10x. Okay, so A is going to be equal to a negative 1, B would be equal to a negative 10, and C would be equal to a negative 8. So quadratic formula means negative times a negative 10, which is a positive 10, plus or minus our b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a, which is a negative 1. All right, so we'll have 10 plus or minus the square root of a 100 minus 4, so that'll be a minus a 32 all over a negative 2. So 10 plus or minus the square root of a 68 all over a negative 2. And 68 is 17 times 4. So this will be, square root of a 4 is a 2. So this will be 2 square roots of 17. So this will be negative 5 plus or minus square roots of 17. When you simplify that negative 2. Okay, so work on your homework for this. Tomorrow we will have a worksheet on solving all the same way. So using your quadratic formula, factoring, and completing the square, and you'll work together in groups of 3. So if you have any questions on this, please let me know. Y'all have a great day.